No candidate can be elected president without winning the vote of working-class Americans. In the recent debates, President Bush spoke of putting cash back into people's wallets with his tax cuts and said the best way to create more jobs was to fix our educational system and offer more job training. Senator Kerry promised to raise the minimum wage, stop tax incentives for companies that outsource jobs, and offered a comprehensive health care plan. How do these issues play with workers, and what role will labor unions have in the election? I'm Sarah Bartlett, and this is our topic today on USA Inc. Joining us today is Ed Ott, the Public Policy Director of the New York City Central Labor Council, which represents over 1 million workers from nearly 400 local unions. Ed, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
What does the landscape look like to you in terms of the presidential election from the standpoint of the labor movement?
Well, I mean, in terms of where we're really at, it's as competitive as everything people are hearing on TV and reading in the newspapers. From our point of view, I think this is probably our strongest organizational effort that I've ever remembered. It's more grassroots focused. We're putting everything we have into this election. There are people from this city who've spent the last several months in places like Ohio, New Mexico, Pennsylvania. Buses leave this city of working people every weekend going into Pennsylvania trying to win that state. So from that point of view, it's actually been very good for the labor movement, no matter what happens, although we have a desired outcome.
Yes, and just for the record, let's say what that is.
Well, we're officially supporting John Kerry for president, and we're working very hard to defeat President Bush.
This all costs money, presumably. How are you able to tap into the coffers and support this effort?
Well, organized labor has for many, many years maintained political action funds, both at a local level, a regional level, and a national level. And when you put them together, they're significant. I mean, they're nothing like what our opposition can raise from corporations, but it's not an insignificant amount of money, and I never poor-mouth the labor movement about an election. We have good human resources. Our volunteer base is terrific, so it compensates for a loss of money. We can't compete on TV, but we can compete on the street.
Is the level of organization so much greater because the issues are so much more important, or because you just figured out long ahead of time that this was going to be necessary?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. One, there's some leftover baggage from the last election with Al Gore, where we felt we won that election, we lost it in the courts. So there was some residual skepticism about President Bush from the beginning. I think that in terms of the policies he's carried forward, it actually motivated the base. We have local leaders who are, mainstream Americans who are not disposed towards one party or the other, who are truly motivated against Bush in this election. It's very different than almost any presidential election I remember.
What is driving that motivation? Why is it?
Well, I think that they believe that George Bush and his administration are doing two things which are fundamentally dangerous to us. One is taking standards that have taken really over a century to win. Things like the minimum wage, how the New Deal set up Social Security, those kinds of issues, overtime provisions, and he has demonstrated a willingness to dismantle that. For organized labor, that is the end of everything that we have built, and we view it in generational terms. Our objective as a movement is to allow each generation to live slightly better than the previous one. This president is a threat to that, and we're committed to trying to take him out.
Now, presumably within your ranks, there are Republicans and Democrats. How much flack have you gotten from the Republican side of the membership that you're doing this?
Very little. I mean, that's my point before. Some of our members, in fact, are Republicans. Some of our leaders are, in fact, Republicans. We have the broadest unity that I have ever seen in a presidential election in opposition to an incumbent president. The last time we were through this was against George Bush Sr. and starts out really in August with a lot of skepticism at the base that we could defeat George Bush. He had 9 months previous been the most popular president in history. The organizational effort came together there. This exceeds that.
Let's talk about the minimum wage. You mentioned that. What is the position of your organization on the minimum wage, and how do you look at the two presidential contenders on that?
Well, you know, our view on the minimum wage is that is exactly that. It is a floor that is designed for people not to fall below. It's not designed to make people rich, that's for sure. We don't believe you can live on the minimum wage, and in labor unions we try to exceed those standards. But we do believe that it is a beginning. It's a floor by which we can measure progress against. This president has demonstrated a desire to, his rhetoric is to eliminate it in his early days, but right now they're more sophisticated. They would like to create subcategories, sub-minimum wages. Younger workers should be paid less for same work. Senior workers should be paid less for the same work. We believe in equal pay for equal work. We built our movement around it. We're not stepping back one step. In terms of Kerry, Kerry has been more decidedly pro-labor in the United States Senate than President Bush has been as president. We believe that he's committed to certain types of minimum standards. We're very comfortable with him on that level.
Do you feel that he's coming out on the minimum wage where you want? I mean, he's talking about a $7
Well,
level.
Look, people live in New York City. You can't live on $7 an hour, but it's certainly a step in the right direction in our view. We never expect as organized labor to get everything we want out of any president in Washington, but we do expect a certain amount of consideration in our standards and values, and we'll think we'll get a better consideration from Kerry.
Now, if you talk to some of the small business organizations, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, for example, they will tell you that the worst thing that we could do for this economy is to raise the minimum wage, that it's going to force small companies to lay off people who are exactly the ones you're trying to help, the poorest, the least educated, the ones that aren't making much money, but the marginal cost for a business that's right on the edge may be too much, and you could actually have some kind of a backfiring situation.
I've been working since, my first job was in 1963, and every attempt to move the minimum wage, we have seen the same argument, and the American economy has continued to expand and grow. And small business has done fine. The truth of the matter is, small business is probably much more threatened by the desires of big business to monopolize the market than anything that the minimum wage has ever done to them. And it is odd to me that small business owners could look at George Bush's agenda and not feel threatened by it. In fact, I think as a practical matter, many small businesses are going to block with labor as we come down a stretch in this election.
What makes you say that?
Because I think his tax policies actually were bad for small business. Small business is really dependent on immediate expenditure by lower paid workers in the community. This president is creating greater degrees of poverty and shifting money towards the top on the corporate side. And that is very bad for small business. They're going to find themselves unable to compete if this keeps going.
Now, outsourcing has obviously been a big issue during these debates. Do you feel that Senator Kerry's proposals would really do anything to
I
turn
think
that away?
in his course of his tenure in the Senate, we've had some disagreements with Senator Kerry on trade issues in particular. But I think that Kerry also is not indifferent to the impacts of trade policy on the lives of real working people, and he has been better about trying to create programs that might mitigate some of the impacts. Look, in the end, the market's very, very important, and a global economy demands certain amounts of changes in the way we do business, the way people work. The important thing for us is access to training and education to meet the changes in the market so that the workers who are working today arrive with the new. The president and the people around him show an aggressive indifference to taking any responsibility for the impact of the markets. Kerry at least voices some concern about it, and we think we can work better with him there.
If you go to the Bush-Cheney website, they have a nice section about wanting to commit $23 billion to job training. So how do you reconcile that kind of a promise with...
Actions speak louder than words. His labor secretary has been totally indifferent to the impacts of the market on changes in workers. They have a good rhetoric, no program. They don't spend the $23 billion. When this city was flat on its back after 9/11 and we were looking for training money, we were looking for more. They could not bring themselves to do it. And they took all of this money that was designed to help, and they spread it around the country to places that didn't even need it. I don't believe a word they say about job training.
Do you feel that job training can actually make a difference? I mean, Kerry has endorsed similar policies. Do you feel that that can help?
Well, look, I think the best trainers are employers at the work site. If you have an employer-based and worker-based training program, and you can anticipate in certain situations where things are going, you can lay out so that people have given the opportunity. We are making these changes in technology. These changes in the market are coming. These are your options. There's support money there for you to train, and an ability for your employer to allow you to do it would be very helpful. They don't think in those terms. Their attitude is the market rules, and if you fall out of the market, too bad. Well, organized labor was created by workers to prevent and mitigate those market impacts. This president is hostile to that agenda. I don't think he's, the worst human being in the world, but I do think he's very bad for working people.
Regulatory efforts to keep the workplace safe and workers healthy is something that he has certainly been aggressively rolling back. I don't think anyone would really dispute that. Is that something that's a big part of your concern and your agenda?
Yeah. For us, health and safety, when I became active in the labor movement in 1969, the national debate then was over whether or not the workplace was safe and healthful. It was under Richard Nixon, a Republican president, who made a decision that the Occupational Safety and Health Act was absolutely necessary based on a study that they had done of the impact of workers. What we're seeing now is a return to the bad old days, where there are no safety and health standards that protect people in a workplace. If you recognize that business and the workplace is a competitive environment, then you don't want to allow employers to cut on things that could actually damage people. But employers will be driven by the market to cut on safety equipment, safety programs, if that's the only place where they think they can stay competitive. What the government has to do is create a level playing field so that they're not allowed to do that, and they have to find better, more positive ways to compete. We believe in competition, but we don't believe in competition that destroys people at the point of work.
The whole issue of regulation and safety is one that Bush, I think, would use rhetoric to say he supports. He just feels that it's gotten excessive, it's overburdensome, and it's actually a job creation plan, in his view, to cut back some of these regulations.
Well, here's the odd thing. If you go back over the history and look at things like workers' compensation, health and safety regulation, they were designed to protect employers from being sued in the marketplace. If you opted into the workers' comp, you lost your ability to go and sue the employer. Now this guy, he wants tort reform, which reduces the rights of workers to sue their employer, and at the same time he wants to eliminate the built-in health and safety protections. This is a return to the 19th century.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back.
The Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College of the City University of New York is the largest and most diverse accredited business school in the United States, offering high-quality, full-time and part-time degree programs at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. For information about the Zicklin School of Business, please visit our website, zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu. That's zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Ed Ott, Director of Public Policy of the New York City Central Labor Council. You were talking about the 19th century, and that makes me want to ask you about health care. How do you feel about what the Bush administration has done on workers' health care, and what do you think of the new Senator Kerry proposal?
Well, I can't say he's done anything about workers' health care because he has demonstrated no commitment to improving it. His rhetoric is also he wants the market to determine what health care should be. We think that that's wrong. We think that there should be certain standards on health care that everybody gets. Millions of people are without health care coverage in this country, and health care is increasingly expensive. And some of that expense is really driven by the desires of people to have the best of everything in health care. It's driven by the purchasing of machinery in health places that has added to the cost. But the government, we don't believe, can be indifferent to the fact that there are millions and millions of people in this country with no health care. It is, in fact, a public health problem to have people walking around with no health care. And in the end, it's bad for everybody, including the employers. A workforce without health care can increasingly becomes an unreliable workforce. So we want some commitment on the part of government, one, to make sure everybody has some access to a minimal amount of health care, and that the cost of health care be a major consideration of the government, and they should begin to affect policies that allow people to reduce that cost. A little thing on drugs. This guy, president, who talks about free market capitalism more than any president in my lifetime, will not allow inexpensive drugs to come in from Canada. On medical research, they will not accept world standard research from European countries and make them run through a terrible bureaucratic process here to get new medicines and new techniques into the market. They're hypocrites. I don't understand these guys. They're for capitalism when it's convenient for them on the oil side and indifferent to capitalism and what it could be doing for people on the healthcare side. I don't know where this president's going.
How do you feel about the Kerry health plan? Do you think that can really do something, or is that just simply...
Well, frankly, it's not a plan. At this point, it's a notion. It's a notion of in a direction that we want to go. A plan has real numbers attached to it and measured impacts. But to say at this point it's a plan is a little unfair in the middle of a campaign. What we agree with is that Kerry believes there is a role for government in the whole healthcare system, and we would agree with that. The labor movement itself is probably divided on the specifics of what should be done about healthcare, depending on where you are. If you remember during the Clinton years, the labor movement was split 3 ways over that proposal, but at least it was a proposal that we could wrap ourselves around and discuss. This president's not going to offer a plan. That's the plan. There is no plan.
Well, as you've indicated, he certainly has made it clear to the world that he's very pro-big business. And at this point, the labor movement, it's very hard for you to react, isn't it? Because you've become so small, your political power is not what it used to be.
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter is our numbers are not what they used to be. But that's very consistent with our history. I mean, if you back up to the beginnings of the organized labor movement in this country, we have always trailed the organization of capital 50 to 75 years. When capitalism was already monopoly and national, we were local and intermittent. We created ad hoc organizations dependent on the issues. It took us almost 3/4 of a century to get to the point where we had permanent organization and legal status. So that's not unusual. On the business side, they are much more innovative. They have the ability to invest where they want to invest, and we react. So we're in really a catch-up phase. It is a mistake, and I think this president is about to learn that mistake, to underestimate the political power of organized labor. We have a grassroots movement that reaches into many, many households. We have people in an organizational form. As weak as people think we are, we're the most highly organized form in this country outside of business itself.
It's just that, you know, I think the last number I saw was that you're 13% of the workforce and even less in the private sector. So I would assume that your organization and your momentum is being reflected in the polls right now.
Well, we're throwing everything we have into this election for a reason, obviously. We believe that what this election partially is about is that workers are entitled to a voice at work. They are entitled to representation on the job. One of these candidates believes in that. The other one doesn't. We're supporting John Kerry because we believe that he believes that labor is one of the institutions of democracy and that he will support that. Will employers make it easy for us to organize? They never have. They never will. Workers got to suck it up and be brave. You want organization? Create it.
I think that Bush has done a good job in the debates of making Kerry, painting him as the liberal from Massachusetts and talking about how he embraces the market and all Kerry wants to do is give rise to big government, which for a lot of Americans is very scary rhetoric. How do you work to...
Well, listen, I had a discussion a week ago with a group of German trade unionists who were visiting the city. And one of the things that was very interesting to me was that they view this election as a discussion between the center and the center-right. John Kerry is a mainstream Democratic Party politician who is not into any form of radical change. To characterize the guy as a liberal would probably make some old-time liberals like you and Humphrey spin in their grave. He has been part of the Washington scene. The guy's been nothing but responsible, and his whole time he's been in the Senate and in the Congress. So, you know, that's just campaign rhetoric to me. It's one of the terrible things that's happened in the American political discourse is that it's more important to take somebody down than really engage their ideas. Bush and Kerry got a lot to talk about, and you saw elements of it in the last debate that they had. This could have been a great presidential campaign. Instead, it's in the gutter.
But I do think that you have some work to do in terms of trying to, even though it's true that that's rhetoric, it still resonates with a lot of the population. So how do you penetrate that? How do you get people to sort of turn that aside and say, well, you're right, it's deeper than that. It's not.
I think there's a couple of things. I mean, one, it is not possible to build this movement unless workers' legal rights are respected by employers. And right now, lawyers encourage employers to fire workers immediately at the first sign of organization. Loss of job is capital punishment for workers. If you're going to exercise your basic right to organize and lose your job, poll after poll tells us that workers ask, would you like to have a union? They say yes, but they never ask the second question, are you willing to risk your job to get it? And the answer is no.
So how do you fight that? I mean, they've been very aggressive in trying to.
We have now proposed what we call the Voice at Work Act. We are going to bring it into the next Congress, hopefully with a Democratic president. We are going to try to strengthen the rights of workers to organize by changing the federal law. If we don't do that, it's going to be a harder fight. But you have to keep in mind, too, that organized labor has only been fully legal and fully legitimate for half a century. It's not unusual for us to be in this circumstance.
But I think the thing that's telling is that the numbers are dropping. I mean, it was 20%, then it was 17%, now it's 13%.
The numbers are dropping for good reason. If you look at the city and this state, we lost over 1 million industrial jobs as the market pulled those jobs to other economies. What's happened is in the new economy, workers have not been able to get that foothold that they need, and partially because employers are as aggressive now as they were at the beginning of the 20th century about how they deal with it. Workers cannot risk the loss of employment to exercise their basic right. And we're going to have to figure out how we deal with that. Let me say this. Employers should think about workers without organized labor. What are the other forms that they will resort to? And history is full of political movements that would probably make certain capitalist employers very uncomfortable. Labor is a responsible mainstream protection for workers. They should think about it.
Do you have any prediction as to how this election is going to turn out?
I can predict. I'm usually more wrong than right about these things, but I actually think it's possible, looking at the numbers today, that Kerry can win the Electoral College, and even we could reverse the last election. Democrats could lose the popular vote, and they could win the Electoral College. And I think the reason why that's possible is in the states where Bush is ahead, he's ahead by 70-30 in his solid base states. In the states where Kerry is ahead, it's a much closer election. But we are winning, as I speak, the electoral vote. This election still comes down to Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio. It's going to be very interesting.
It is going to be very interesting. Are you worried about dirty tricks? And
no.
Do you have anybody?
No, I've been around dirty politics too long to worry about dirty tricks. I expect the worst.
But does the labor union does the union movement have anybody at the polls trying to ensure that? There's
a major national organized effort with labor and others to ensure that people have the right to vote. But fortunately, we're in a country where it's a secret ballot. We really don't know what people do when they go in that booth, but we encourage everybody to vote, and we register people, and we don't ask them how they're going to vote. In the end, preserving of the franchise is as important as who wins the election.
If Kerry does win, what are some of the top things that the labor movement would want to work with him on to try to maybe move him off of some positions?
Well, I would think 3 things. One is this Voice at Work campaign for workers and making sure that workers actually have some rights to organize. I think, 2, this question of a national health care that provides health care for everybody and begins to come to terms with how we get the costs down, and that could include the effective use of the market. And I think, thirdly, that there is a national question on education that needs to be done. If you're going to transition the economy, you have to transition your educational programs. The truth of the matter is, workers need a lifetime access to education and training, as do employers.
And what would that imply?
Well, I think there has to be a national program that provides resources to employers that recognize that in order for them to compete worldwide, that there are times when the government has to assist them with changes in technology and the training of the workforce to get that technology. What we have to do is structure education so that employers are willing to utilize it as a form of investment.
All of these programs sound great. You'd all want to have them, but they're going to cost a lot of money. Isn't that just going to create an even worse budget deficit problem? And how would Kerry ever deal with something like that?
I'm glad you asked. This president inherited a country where the books were balanced, we were in the black, the economy was stable, and people were working. And he spent 4 years running into the ground. Whatever John Kerry does, he can't do any worse on those counts. From our point of view, things cost what things cost. I think that that's what most market capitalists would believe. We'll pay what it takes. good management's a different question. This president does not understand that the deficits that he has run up are irresponsible.
But I think you have to say more than it costs what it costs. I mean, that's going to translate politically into this is going to be a huge deficit.
Of course, in the private sector, it's up to the government to manage within the economy. And what was very clear here is that this president cannot manage within the economy. An economy that it's not terrible, but he has run deficits that are just unbelievable, and trade deficits, which will in the end impact this country horribly. For a guy that's so tough, he's been incredibly weak in defending our trade rights.
We've been very fortunate to have the New York City Central Labor Council's Public Policy Director, Ed Ott, as our guest today. Thank you for joining.
Some people think of New York as the world's second home. The City University of New York, with students coming from 90 countries and speaking more than 155 languages, is the world's first university. Find us on the web at cuny.edu or call us at 1-800-CUNY-YES.
Amazing how one's perspective can change. When you first get out of school and experience the harsh realities of the low-wage economy, you think unions are the greatest thing on earth. They fight for you to get a decent raise, make sure you have at least some modest health insurance, and protect you from exploitative bosses. Fast forward to middle age, and suddenly, if you're trying to run a small business, unions are all that seem to stand between you and more profits. Or if you're managing employees, you might think of unions as obstacles to your drive for greater efficiency. Depending on where you stand in life, the two presidential candidates offer starkly different choices. President Bush's administration has worked aggressively to roll back regulations that would enhance worker health and safety, preferring to rely on the marketplace as an arbiter of standards. Senator Kerry wants to intervene in the market by raising the minimum wage and providing the option of a health plan that would take the fear out of getting sick. Each candidate talks about how religion guides them, invoking the love thy neighbor as thyself mantra. The issue is, what's the best way to show that love? For USA Inc., I'm Sarah Bartlett.